Imagine a famous bodybuilder walking into the consulting room of, well, let's call him our fictional detective, Medlock Holmes.
Right. I love this setup.
Yeah, so this guy is physically magnificent. I mean, we are talking about shoulders so broad he has to turn slightly just to fit through the doorframe. A deeply sculpted chest, powerful arms. They look like they could effortlessly bend steel.
He just commands the entire room by sheer mass alone.
Exactly. The sheer mass of the man is overwhelming. But Holmes, being the astute observer he is, he notices something else entirely. The man cannot stop looking at his own reflection.
It's relentless, isn't it?
It really is. He catches his gaze in the window pane facing the street. He subtly checks his posture in the polished brass base of a desk lamp. Even the convex back of a silver spoon on the tea tray becomes just another mirror to scrutinize his own dimensions.
Wow, he's trapped.
Right. And as they speak, Holmes begins to realize that for this absolute colossus of a man, every single missed gym session feels catastrophic. I mean, every slight microscopic reduction in his muscle size feels like he is losing a piece of his very self.
Yeah, because it's not just muscle at that point.
Spot on. Holmes quickly realizes this is not simply a story about muscles or vanity. It's a story about identity, right? And a mind that is quietly collapsing under the weight of its own armor.
It is a profound psychological vulnerability, and it's hiding right there in plain sight, masked by the ultimate symbol of physical strength. And I think it perfectly encapsulates the foundation of what we are unpacking in this deep dive today.
Which is exactly why we're here.
Yeah, so if we want to establish a firm anchor for you as you listen along today, is this. Psychiatry is the study of how brain, mind, and experience interact, and critically, how that delicate process can go wrong.
And with these specific drugs, it goes spectacularly wrong.
Absolutely. When we look at anabolic-androgenic steroids, we are looking at a substance that fundamentally rewires all three of those domains simultaneously. It alters the brain's neurochemistry at a cellular level. It dramatically distorts the mind's perception of the physical self, and it completely reshapes the individual's lived experience in society.
It is entirely a story of identity. And to untangle that story today, we are diving deep into some deeply fascinating medical literature. Specifically, we're looking at the clinical insights drawn from Chapter 1111 of Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry.
Which is an incredible resource for this.
It really is. We are going to figure out how a single substance can completely rewrite a person's brain, their body, and their sense of self. We'll trace the path from the microscopic biology happening inside the cells all the way out to the extreme behaviors we see in the clinic.
Right, building a robust mental model so you can actually understand the clinical reasoning behind treating these disorders.
But, to even begin that journey, we have to clear away some massive cultural misconceptions, because I feel like we all have this collective image in our heads of what a quote-unquote steroid user it looks like.
Oh, definitely. And frankly, we are conflating entirely different worlds of medicine when we do that. The terminology itself is the source of massive, widespread confusion.
Not just for the public, though, right?
No, not at all. It happens remarkably often within clinics everywhere. We have to firmly separate anabolic-androgenic steroids from corticosteroids. They're completely different classes of drugs, yet they share that single, highly misleading catch-all word, steroid.
It's a bit of a linguistic trap.
Exactly. So anabolic-androgenic steroids, which we often refer to as AKS, are synthetic derivatives of the male hormone testosterone. They're engineered to do two very specific things. First, promote muscle growth, which is the anabolic effect.
Right.
And second, promote masculinization, which is the androgenic effect. Corticosteroids, on the other hand, well, they include naturally occurring hormones like cortisol or synthetic medical derivatives like prednisolone.
So the stuff you get for a bad rash or a chest infection?
Precisely. They are immunosuppressants and anti-inflammatories. They have absolutely zero muscle-building properties.
So conflating the two is essentially like confusing a wrecking ball with a fire extinguisher just because you happen to find them both sitting on the same construction site.
That is a perfect analogy. One is meant to build or destroy structure, and the other is meant to put out a fire.
Yet patients and clinicians cross these wires constantly. I mean, a patient might sit in a clinic and say, oh, I'm taking steroids. And the doctor, looking at a swollen knee, assumes they mean an asthma inhaler or a joint injection.
Right. But in reality, the patient is injecting massive doses of synthetic testosterone derivatives that they, acquired out of a duffel bag at the local gym.
It's terrifying when you think about the communication breakdown there. And this terminological confusion is precisely what skews our understanding of the epidemiological reality, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It completely distorts who we think is actually using these drugs.
Hmm?
If you were to ask someone on the street to describe a typical steroid user, they would almost certainly describe a cheating teenager trying to make the secondary school football team.
Or like an elite Olympic sprinter trying to shave a fraction of a second off their time.
Exactly. That is the pervasive cultural myth.
Yeah.
But the textbook data completely shatters that assumption. When you look at the reality, the median age of onset for genuine TAS use is approximately 23 years old.
Wait, 23? I find that age of onset really striking.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, because if you look at classic illicit substances, say cannabis, cocaine, or early opioid experimentation, you typically see the onset of use firmly rooted in the teenage years, right? Driven by peer pressure or teenage rebellion.
Yes, exactly.
But 23 is a fully formed adult.
It is a crucial distinction. And it perfectly explains why high school surveys, which public health officials have relied upon for decades to track drug trends, are notoriously wrong when it comes to ASS.
Oh, because the kids don't know what they're actually taking.
Well, let's look at why these anonymous teenage surveys produce such extraordinarily high false positive rates. You distribute a questionnaire in a secondary school and ask, have you ever used steroids without a doctor's prescription? Suddenly, you get a terrifyingly high number of teenagers ticking the yes box.
Cue the public health panic.
Right. But when researchers actually sat down and interviewed these adolescents to verify the data, they discovered that the teenagers were entirely confused by the terminology we just discussed.
Ah, so they were mixing up the wrecking ball and the fire extinguisher?
Exactly. They had purchased legal, over-the-counter nutritional supplements, like protein powder or creatine, or they'd used a family member's leftover corticosteroid cream for a skin rash, and they mistakenly believed they were doing steroids.
That makes so much sense. They see a giant tub of pre-workout powder with a lightning bolt on it at the local shop and assume that's what the survey is asking about.
Or they think their prescription asthma medication makes them a steroid user. The reality is that genuine muscle-building IS are largely available only via the black market.
Which requires a level of access, funding, and intent that most adolescents simply do not possess.
Precisely. Once researchers meticulously control for all these false positives, the terrifying numbers plummet to near zero. The true prevalence of illicit AS use in teenage girls is essentially non-existent. And for teenage boys, it drops to roughly 1%.
But the flip side of that teenage myth is the adult reality. Because while teenage use might be a statistical ghost, adult use is a massive hidden epidemic, isn't it?
It truly is. By adulthood, epidemiological data estimates that between 2.9 and 4.0% of American men have tried AS at some point in their lives.
Wow.
Yeah, when you extrapolate that percentage across the population, that translates to millions of men. But if we look at women, the user base practically vanishes again.
Really? It's that skewed?
The textbook notes an astonishing male-to-female ratio of 50 to 1. To put that in perspective, it was a major, rigorously designed 2-year study conducted across 3 large American cities that actively tried to recruit female ReSafe users.
And what did they find?
After 2 years of searching, they could only find 25 women in total.
That is mind-boggling.
So from a public health and clinical standpoint, this is overwhelmingly a disorder of adult men. And crucially, we must abandon the Olympian myth. It is a disorder of men seeking appearance enhancement, not athletic performance.
They just want to look good for the mirror.
The vast majority are not trying to win a gold medal, no. They just want to look bigger and more formidable.
Which takes us right back to our colossal man in Medlock Holmes' office. But, you know, if millions of men are doing this, why does it feel so hidden? Why isn't this something they bring up during their annual checkups?
That brings us to a really dark, fascinating chapter in medical history. It perfectly explains why these men will almost never tell their doctors what they are doing.
There is a profound historical distrust between AS users and the medical community, isn't there?
A massive one. To understand it, we have to trace the timeline. Testosterone was first synthesized in a laboratory in Germany in 1935. By the 1940s, psychiatrists were actually using it clinically to treat what they termed the male climacteric.
Which was basically what...
It was essentially their way of describing middle-age depression or lethargy in men. But then, the focus radically shifted from the mind to the muscle.
Right, because of the sports applications?
Yes, the sheer athletic potential of these synthetic derivatives was discovered shortly after the Second World War. By the 1950s, Russian weightlifters began using early forms of testosterone to absolutely dominate international strength competitions.
And that just escalated from there.
It escalated to a full-blown pharmaceutical arms race during the Cold War. The most notorious example, of course, was East Germany's state-sponsored doping program. The state systematically administered AS to its athletes.
And the results of that were insane, right?
Oh, it allowed a relatively small country of only 18 million people to win over 150 Olympic gold medals between 1960 and 1990. The physical results were just undeniable.
So the athletes, the coaches, and the geopolitical strategists all knew for an absolute fact that these drugs worked miracles for muscle growth and physical dominance. What on earth was the broader medical community doing during this time?
Well, this is where we see one of the most significant historic blunders in sports medicine, occurring primarily in the 1960s and 1970s. The medical and scientific community decided they needed to rigorously test whether AAS actually built muscle under controlled conditions.
Okay, sounds reasonable on paper.
The intention was good, but the execution was catastrophically flawed. They designed placebo-controlled studies, but ethically and practically, they used dosages and durations of TRAS that were far, far below what the athletes were actually injecting in the field.
Well, yeah, because giving someone a massive black market dose of an experimental hormone wouldn't pass an ethics board, I imagine, even back then.
Exactly, but the athletes were already doing it to themselves anyway. Not surprisingly, because they used such minimal doses, these studies produced completely negative results. The subjects didn't get massive.
So the scientists looked at that and said, see, it doesn't work.
That's exactly what happened. Based entirely on these highly flawed low-dose trials, highly reputable pharmacology and endocrinology textbooks formally concluded that AS did not build muscle and were entirely ineffective for athletic purposes. They essentially declared it all a placebo effect.
I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a serious weightlifter in the 1970s. You and all your peers at the local gym are literally putting on 40 pounds of solid striated muscle in a matter of months.
Right?
You are lifting weights you couldn't have budged a year ago. Then you open a prestigious medical textbook or read a statement from a leading physician that explicitly states the drug you are holding in your hand does not work.
What would you think?
You would immediately conclude that the doctors were either complete fools who didn't understand the real world or pathological liars trying to hoard the drugs for themselves.
And that is exactly the conclusion they drew. It bred a deep, enduring contempt and profound distrust for the medical profession among the subculture of mass users.
And that legacy lives on today.
The clinical meaning of this legacy today cannot be overstated. The textbook cites contemporary studies showing that a staggering 56% of users never disclosed their AS use to any doctor.
Over half. That's wild.
They view physicians as inherently ignorant on the subject. Even more alarming, 40% of users explicitly stated they would trust medical advice regarding steroids from their local black market drug dealer at least as much as they would trust a licensed physician.
They trust the guy selling vials out of a gym bag in a locker room over a doctor with a decade of medical training. That is just, it's the tragic legacy of bad science.
It really is.
So we know the early researchers tested the wrong doses. That leads us directly to the biology. What happens when you test the real doses? We need to look at the mechanisms and models, the biology of excessive force, essentially.
To truly understand the biological impact, we have to look at what we call the dosage chasm. Let's establish a baseline first. A normal, healthy adult male naturally produces testosterone that results in blood concentrations ranging from about 300 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter.
Okay, 300 to 1,000.
Right. If a patient cannot produce their own testosterone, a physician might prescribe a therapeutic replacement dose, which is typically around 200 milligrams of a drug like testosterone cypionate administered every 2 weeks. That maintains a physiologically normal state.
Okay, so the healthy baseline is maintained by about 200 milligrams every 2 weeks. What are the illicit users taking to achieve these massive physiques?
Illicit users take dosages that are 10 to 100 times higher than those therapeutic levels.
100 times higher?
Yes. And they don't just take a little extra. They engage in a practice called stacking. This means they strategically combine multiple different forms of TRAS simultaneously, often mixing oral derivatives with various injectable testosterone esters.
So it's not just one drug?
Not at all. A user might take a synthetic oral steroid every single day, while simultaneously administering massive intramuscular injections multiple times a week. The goal is to flood the system and achieve an astronomical, supraphysiological concentration of androgens in the bloodstream.
So we have this massive flood of synthetic hormones surging through the blood. How does this actually work on a cellular level? Let's dive into the pharmacodynamics. What happens when these drugs actually meet a cell?
It is essentially a two-pronged attack on the cells.
Mm-hmm.
We categorize these as genomic and non-genomic actions. First, let's look at the genomic actions, which are responsible for the physical transformation.
Right, the muscle building.
Exactly. All steroid drugs, including AAS, are synthesized in vivo from cholesterol. Because of this, they share a very specific chemical architecture, a 4-ring, 19-carbon structure. The crucial detail here is that because they are derived from cholesterol, they are highly lipophilic, meaning they are fat-soluble.
And why does that lipophilic nature matter so much? I mean, most medications we take, like a headache pill, they don't just melt into our cells, do they?
No, many typical medications are water-soluble. They circulate in the blood and have to find a specific receptor sitting on the outside surface of a cell membrane to send a signal inside, much like a key turning a lock on a front door.
So they have to ask permission to get in.
Exactly.
Right.
But because AAS are lipophilic, the cell membrane, which is made of lipids, presents no barrier. The steroid molecule simply passes right through the cell wall like a ghost passing through a solid wall.
Oh, wow.
Once inside the cytoplasm of the cell, it binds to a specific intracellular androgen receptor.
So it bypasses the outer security, slips right into the main body of the cell, finds a receptor, and then what?
That new receptor steroid complex doesn't stay in the cytoplasm. It travels directly into the nucleus of the cell, the control room where your DNA is housed.
It goes straight to the source code.
Yes, it physically binds to the DNA itself and alters gene transcription. It is literally rewriting the manufacturing instructions the cell is following. It forces the cell to initiate massive, unprecedented levels of new protein synthesis.
And in muscle tissue.
In muscle tissue, this genomic action translates over weeks and months into explosive muscle growth.
It's basically hijacking the factory's blueprint and demanding it build double the amount of muscle fiber. That perfectly explains the bodybuilder. But, this is a psychiatry deep dive. The brain is where things get genuinely wild because these drugs aren't just acting on muscle genes, are they?
No, not at all. The brain is profoundly affected, and this brings us to the non-genomic actions. These are the rapid direct effects that don't involve altering DNA, and they are absolutely crucial for understanding the psychiatric symptoms.
How does that work?
Well, when testosterone crosses into the brain, it is metabolized into potent neurosteroids, specifically one called 3-alpha-androstenediol. Now, instead of traveling to the nucleus, these specific neurosteroids remain at the cell membrane and bind to receptors on the outside of the neurons.
Okay, so these act more like traditional drugs.
Exactly. Most notably, they act as positive allosteric modulators for GABA receptors.
Let's unpack GABA really quickly. That is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's the chemical signal that tells the nervous system to slow down, chill out, and relax, right? It's what drugs like Valium or alcohol act upon.
Yes, exactly. By modulating the GABA receptor, these AA neurosteroids potentiate or amplify the calming action of GABA. This creates a sedative, anxiolytic effect.
Which is strange for a steroid, isn't it?
It is, but ironically, it helps the user tolerate the immense physiological and psychological stress they are subjecting their bodies to in the gym. But it doesn't stop there. Simultaneously, these drugs act on the brain's limbic system, particularly altering dopamine activity in a region called the nucleus accumbens.
A nucleus accumbens. Now, if you've studied addiction at all, that name sets off alarm bells straight away. That's the core of the brain's reward center. That's exactly where drugs like cocaine and opioids do their damage, flooding the brain with pleasure signals.
Precisely. AAS triggers significant dopamine surges in this exact reward center. This creates powerful hedonic, rewarding effects. The user feels a high, a sense of deep satisfaction and euphoria.
And I imagine that leads to trouble down the line.
It leads directly to the etiology of AAS dependence. The textbook notes that approximately 32.5% of illicit users will develop a formal dependence syndrome.
That's a huge chunk.
It is. But here is the critical clinical insight. This isn't a simple single-pathway addiction like we might see with other substances. It is a highly complex model driven by 3 distinct overlapping pathways that spring a trap on the user.
I really want to break down these 3 pathways meticulously because this is where the mental model really solidifies for us. Pathway number 1, as I understand it, is driven by body image and muscle dysmorphia.
Yes. This pathway operates on a powerful mechanism of negative reinforcement. Typically, this individual has a pre-existing or underlying body image disorder before they ever touch a needle. They feel physically inadequate, quote-unquote, too small or fragile.
So they start from a place of insecurity.
Right. They begin taking the drugs, they rapidly accumulate massive amounts of muscle, and they feel a profound, intoxicating sense of relief. But then the steroid cycle ends.
And the relief vanishes.
The moment they stop, the thought of losing even a fraction of that muscle mass induces a state of sheer psychological terror. They become so cripplingly anxious about shrinking that they simply cannot tolerate staying off the drugs. They finish a cycle, panic that they are deflating, and immediately start another, eventually using continuously just to stave off the psychological anxiety.
So pathway 1 is the psychological trap, the dysmorphia. What is pathway 2?
Pathway 2 is the neuroendocrine crash, which is also a brutal form of negative reinforcement, but this one is entirely physical. Remember, the human body operates on strict homeostasis. It constantly seeks balance.
Right.
When a user pumps their bloodstream full of massive amounts of exogenous external testosterone, the brain's hypothalamus senses this massive surplus. It signals the pituitary gland, which in turn sends a signal down to the testes, telling them to completely shut down the natural production of testosterone.
They just turn off.
In medical terms, the drugs have shut down the hypothalamic pituitary testicular, or HPT, axis.
Let me just use an analogy here. It's like a thermostat in a house in the middle of winter. The testes are the furnace, and the brain is the thermostat. If you drag a massive pile of wood into the living room and build a raging bonfire, which represents the injected steroids, the thermostat senses the immense heat.
Right.
It immediately turns the furnace completely off. It basically says, we have plenty of heat, shut down the factory.
That is an excellent analogy. The problem occurs when the bonfire burns out, when the user stops taking the illicit steroids. The internal furnace doesn't just instantly flick back on.
The thermostat doesn't realize the fire is gone.
Exactly. The HPT axis can remain completely dormant for weeks, months, or in some severe cases, it never fully recovers its normal function. The user suddenly plummets into a state of profound hypogonadism. They are producing virtually zero testosterone.
And what does zero testosterone feel like for an adult man?
It is devastating. It results in severe, crushing depression, profound fatigue where getting out of bed feels impossible, and a complete loss of libido and erectile function.
That sounds agonizing.
The physical and emotional dysphoria is so unbearable that the user resumes taking SS simply to feel normal again. They aren't trying to get huge anymore. They are desperately self-medicating a catastrophic endocrine crash.
That is absolutely brutal. So we have the psychological terror of losing muscle in pathway 1, the physical agony of an endocrine crash in pathway 2. What is the third pathway?
Pathway 3 is classical hedonic addiction, driven by positive reinforcement. This goes back to those non-genomic effects on the nucleus accumbens we just discussed. The dopamine surges create a literal high, a sense of euphoria, boundless energy, and a feeling of total invincibility.
And the brain chases that.
It chases it hard. To illustrate how powerful this is, animal studies have shown that laboratory hamsters will literally self-administer doses of testosterone to the point of their own death, entirely bypassing basic survival needs.
Just hitting the lever over and over.
Yeah, and crucially, this self-administration can be blocked by administering opioid antagonists, which proves that the drugs are inherently chemically rewarding to the brain's deepest pleasure centers.
Let me just pause and make sure I am synthesizing this correctly, because this is mind-boggling. We are looking at a single chemical substance that acts like a severe eating disorder by preying on body dysmorphia.
Yes.
It simultaneously acts like a catastrophic endocrine disruptor that physically shuts down the male reproductive system.
Right.
And it acts like a classic street drug that spikes dopamine in the reward center. It is all three of those things at the exact same time.
You have mapped it perfectly.
Yeah.
It is a triple threat to the brain's homeostatic systems.
Yeah.
The user is psychologically terrified, hormonally starved, and neurochemically addicted all at once. And with the brain buckling under this massive chemical and psychological allostatic load, it is only a matter of time before the clinical symptoms begin to manifest in extreme, sometimes dangerous ways.
Which brings us to the clinical manifestations. We have a brain starved of normal hormones, yet addicted to dopamine, inside a body that fears shrinking. What does that actually look like in the real world? Let's talk about the dose-dependent psychiatric syndromes that happen, quote-unquote, on cycle when the user is actively injecting the drugs.
It is important to contextualize this by noting that most users on relatively low illicit doses, say under 300 milligrams of testosterone equivalent a week, will actually present with very few noticeable psychiatric effects.
Oh, okay, so a low dose isn't necessarily blowing their mind apart.
Right. The body and brain have a remarkable capacity to buffer that level of chemical stress.
Yeah.
But as we established earlier, illicit users don't stay at those low levels. They push the envelope.
Right, they're taking massive stacks. What happens when they push into the danger zone?
The textbook cites extensive observational field studies that clearly define this danger zone. Around 500 milligrams a week, you begin to see minor hypomanic symptoms. The users report needing less sleep, they have racing thoughts, they might become easily irritable or make mildly impulsive decisions.
A bit wound up, basically.
Exactly. But when you cross the threshold of 1,000 milligrams of testosterone equivalent per week, the statistics shift from mild concern to genuine alarm. At these extreme supraphysiological doses, studies show that roughly 12% of users will experience frank clinical mania.
Wow.
And another 12% will experience actual psychotic symptoms, typically manifesting as grandiose or severe paranoid delusions.
This is where we have to address the elephant in the room regarding steroids, right? The concept of roid rage. We see it in movies all the time. How much of that violent stereotype is clinically real, and how much is just a media invention to make a good story?
It is very real, but it is specific to a vulnerable minority of users operating at very high doses. The textbook highlights extensive forensic research, particularly Swedish epidemiological studies, which provide robust data linking ASUs to violent property crimes, weapons offenses, and uncharacteristic homicides.
Uncharacteristic homicides.
Yes, there are well-documented forensic cases of individuals with absolutely no prior criminal record, no history of violent behavior, and no pre-existing psychiatric history, committing brutal murders while under the influence of massive AIS doses.
That's terrifying.
The chemical alteration of their brain chemistry simply overrides their normal behavioral inhibitions.
And from a psychiatric perspective, there are stereotypic features to this violence, aren't there? It isn't just a random bar fight, it has a specific clinical flavor.
Yes, absolutely. When forensic psychiatrists evaluate these specific cases, they consistently identify three stereotypic features. First, the user exhibits a profound delusional sense of invincibility.
Like they can't be hurt.
Right. Second, they display an absolute inability to drop angry obsessions. They will ruminate on a minor perceived, say, someone looking at them wrong in traffic, and they simply cannot let the anger dissipate.
It just leaps in their head.
Exactly. And third, and perhaps most frightening for anyone interacting with them, is the presence of anosognosia.
Anosognosia, let's make sure we define that clearly, because it is a critical neurological concept for you to grasp here.
Anosognosia is a neurological inability to recognize that one is ill or that one's own behavior is abnormal. It is not denial. It is a deficit of self-awareness.
So they literally don't see the problem.
The user has absolutely no clinical insight into their condition. They do not realize that their explosive anger is disproportionate or that their paranoia is completely delusional. To their chemically altered brain, their intense reactions feel entirely logical and justified by the external world.
Which must make de-escalation nearly impossible.
It makes them incredibly dangerous and exceptionally difficult for law enforcement or clinicians to deal with because you cannot reason with someone whose brain refuses to acknowledge that anything is wrong.
So that is the on-cycle nightmare mania, psychosis, and impenetrable anger. But what goes up must eventually come down. What happens during the crash, the off-cycle phase?
The off-cycle crash is the mirror opposite. It is dominated by severe major depressive episodes and high suicidality. We discussed the crushed HPT axis earlier, the furnace being shut off.
Right.
When a man goes from having 100 times the normal level of testosterone driving his system to having absolutely none, the neurochemical whiplash is devastating. The brain is entirely starved of androgens. The resulting depression is profound, lethargic, and incredibly bleak. Suicide attempts during this acute withdrawal phase are a well-documented and severe clinical risk.
So if a clinician is sitting across from a patient who is presenting with severe depression, but the patient is actively denying AS use, which we know over half of them do, what are the physical hallmarks the clinician should be looking for? What are the physical signs of the surreptitious user?
Visually, there are several distinct red flags. If a male patient is unusually muscular, carrying a level of lean mass that seems disproportionate, but presents with severe acne, especially clustered on the back and shoulders, that is a strong indicator of androgen abuse.
And what else?
Another key visual clue is the presence of striae, or stretch marks, particularly radiating around the biceps, the anterior deltoids, and the pectorals.
Because the skin is stretching too fast.
Exactly. This occurs because the muscle tissue under the skin is growing so explosively fast that the dermal layer literally cannot stretch fast enough to accommodate the new volume, causing the skin to tear from the inside out.
I'm looking at the list of physical hallmarks here, and I'm a bit confused by one of them. We're talking about injecting massive amounts of synthetic male hormones. But I've heard users often go bald rapidly and paradoxically actually develop breast tissue.
Yes, gynecomastia.
How does a massive overdose of male hormone cause the development of female physical traits? That seems entirely contradictory.
It is one of the most fascinating paradoxes of endocrinology, and it comes down to an enzyme called aromatase. When a user injects a massive surplus of testosterone into their blood, the body detects an extreme hormonal imbalance.
It knows something is wrong.
Right. In a desperate attempt to restore equilibrium and balance the scales, the body ramps up the production of the aromatase enzyme. This enzyme literally binds to the excess testosterone and converts it directly into estrogen, specifically oestradiol.
Oh, wow. So it just flips it.
Suddenly, this male body is flooded with massive levels of female sex hormones. This massive spike in estrogen stimulates the dormant glandular tissue in the male chest, leading to gynecomastia, the development of breast tissue. It is a direct, unavoidable result of the body desperately trying to manage the external hormonal overload.
And the hair loss.
As for the hair loss, the excess testosterone converts into dihydrotestosterone, or DHT, which aggressively shrinks hair follicles in individuals genetically susceptible to male pattern baldness.
The body just turns against itself trying to survive the flood. And what would a blood test reveal? If a doctor manages to order a comprehensive metabolic panel, what does the internal fingerprint of KS use look like?
The lab abnormalities are stark and dangerous. First, you will see completely suppressed, near undetectable levels of LH and FSH luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone.
Because the thermostat turned them off.
Exactly. These are the crucial pituitary hormones that tell the testes to work. They will be essentially flatlined because the feedback loop is shut down. Second, you see a disastrous, highly atherogenic cholesterol profile.
Which means heart disease risk, right?
Massive risk. AS brutally suppress HDL, the protective good cholesterol, often pushing it into single digits, and aggressively spike LDL, the dangerous bad cholesterol. Finally, you often see spiked hematocrit and hemoglobin levels.
Why does that happen?
AS strongly stimulate red blood cell production in the bone marrow. While this increases oxygen carrying capacity, it makes the blood incredibly thick and viscous like pumping sludge through the veins.
That sounds like a recipe for a clot.
It massively increases the risk of stroke, thrombosis, and sudden cardiovascular events.
Okay, we have mapped the biochemistry, the psychological traps, and the physical signs of the wreckage. Let's ground these abstract mechanisms into the reality of clinical practice. We need to look at the patient in the room. The textbook provides two deeply illustrative case studies that show how these pathways manifest. Let's start with case study 1, Mr. A. He seems to embody the dysmorphic pathway we discussed earlier.
Yes, Mr. A is a textbook example of the muscle dysmorphia dependence model. He is a 26-year-old single white man. He is 69 inches tall, weighs 204 pounds, and has a body fat percentage of just 11%.
Just a wall of muscle, basically.
To put that into perspective, that is a level of dense muscularity and extreme leanness that is essentially impossible to achieve and maintain without continuous chemical assistance. He started lifting weights recreationally at 17, but at 20, he hit a natural plateau and began using AS he purchased from a friend at his local gym.
And he just kept escalating.
Over the next 6 years, he engaged in multiple escalating cycles. His most ambitious stack included injectable testosterone, cypionate, and nandrolone, combined with oral stanozolol and oxandrolone.
And as he pushed those doses higher, what were his psychiatric symptoms? How did the brain react to that chemical soup?
During his cycles, he experienced classic dose-dependent hypomania. He felt invincible, he needed significantly less sleep to function, and he experienced racing thoughts.
Did he act out on it?
We see the clinical impulsivity clearly. While on a cycle, he impulsively bought a $2,700 stereo system on a credit card he knew he could not afford to pay off. We also see the idiosyncratic irritability and stereotypic violence.
Steroid rage.
Right. During a completely standard, minor argument with his girlfriend, he suddenly punched his fist directly through the glass window of her car, an act of sudden violence that was entirely out of character for his normally mild-mannered baseline personality.
But the true pathology, the thing that keeps him locked in the cycle, is his perception of himself, right? It goes right back to our Medlock Holmes metaphor of the man in the mirror.
Exactly. The core of Mr. A's pathology is profound muscle dysmorphia. Despite having a 48-inch chest and 19-inch biceps, he's objectively gigantic by any societal standard. He checks his reflection dozens of times a day.
Still thinks he's small.
He constantly evaluates his size in shop windows as he walks down the street. He even checks his reflection in the back of a spoon at a restaurant. He becomes highly anxious, almost panicky, if he misses a single scheduled workout. And tragically, he refuses to go to the beach or a public pool with his friends because he is genuinely terrified of looking too small or inadequate in a bathing suit.
That's heartbreaking.
At the time of his clinical presentation, he is highly anxious because he's lost a tiny bit of weight while off-cycle, and he is desperately eager to resume injecting just to silence the anxiety in his head.
He has built this massive physical fortress, but inside it, he is utterly terrified and feels completely weak. Now let's contrast him with case study 2, Mr. B. If Mr. A represents the dysmorphic psychological trap, Mr. B represents the polysubstance, severe psychiatric user who completely destroys his life.
Mr. B's case is much darker and demonstrates the extreme end of the neurobiological disruption. He started an AS cycle intending it to last a standard 16 weeks, but he became so intoxicated by the rapid muscle gains and the hypomanic energy that he extended the cycle to 30 continuous weeks.
Wow, 30 weeks?
That is over half a year of massive, unremitting androgen exposure to his brain and endocrine system. As a result, when he finally stopped, his HPT axis was entirely crushed, and he suffered profound, long-lasting hypogonadism.
And his behavior while on the drugs left a trail of destruction, didn't it?
Yes. While on the massive doses, he became hyperconfident, aggressively grandiose, and highly sexually promiscuous, which directly led to the destruction of his marriage and subsequent divorce. Over the years of cycling on and off, his mood swings became increasingly brittle, as the textbook describes it.
Brittle. What does that mean in this context?
Instead of just transitioning between high and low, he would experience simultaneous euphoria and intense suicidality, a highly unstable, agonizing, mixed affective state. He required multiple emergency psychiatric hospitalizations, he took a massive near-fatal overdose of antidepressants during a crash, and he eventually required ECT electroconvulsive therapy just to manage his severe, treatment-resistant depression during withdrawal.
Good grief. And his body.
Furthermore, a comprehensive cardiac evaluation revealed he had developed dilated cardiomyopathy. His heart was enlarged and failing to pump effectively, a condition directly attributable to his years of high-dose TS use thickening the heart muscle.
But looking at Mr. B's clinical history, there is a crucial puzzle piece that seems out of place to me. Why was he also heavily using opioids and alcohol? The case notes mention he was taking nalbuphine, oxycodone, and drinking heavily. Why do we see this polysubstance abuse intertwined with steroid use? It seems counterintuitive for someone obsessed with their physical body to abuse downers.
It is a fascinating and critical piece of clinical reasoning for any psychiatrist to grasp. The textbook notes a remarkably strong epidemiological link between AAS and opioid use. In fact, in one study of men admitted to an opioid rehabilitation facility, a staggering 25% had a prior history of AS use.
Wait, 25%?
Yes, and for many of those men, AS was the very first drug they had ever injected. It primed them for the needle.
Why do they mix them, though?
There are several clinical reasons. First, on a purely functional level, they use opioids and alcohol to self-medicate the severe physical pain of lifting incredibly heavy weights constantly. Joints and tendons tear under that unnatural load. Second, they use the sedative effects of alcohol and opioids to forcefully manage the manic hyperactivation, the crippling anxiety, and the severe insomnia caused by the high-dose steroids.
I see. So they're essentially using chemical downers to try and take the edge off the massive, unmanageable upper effect of the AS. They are trying to manually regulate their own nervous system.
Precisely. But there is a much deeper neurobiological link at play. AAS, alcohol, and opioids all fundamentally hit the endogenous opioid and dopamine systems in the brain. They share a final common pathway of dopamine augmentation in the reward centers. The user is unknowingly compounding the reward signals in their brain, which vastly accelerates the physical addiction process across all the substances.
So as a psychiatrist, looking at a patient like Mr. B, whose brain chemistry is in chaos, whose hormones are flatlined, and whose heart is failing, how on earth do you even begin to intervene? What are the treatment protocols to bring someone back from that edge?
The most important clinical takeaway for any practitioner is that treatment requires a strictly multidisciplinary approach. A psychiatrist cannot treat this in isolation. They must work hand in hand with an endocrinologist.
Because of the HPT axis shutdown.
Exactly. You have to aggressively address the endocrine repair simultaneously with the psychiatric repair, or the patient will inevitably relapse.
Let's break down that dual approach. How does the endocrinologist repair the hardware, the physical hormonal system?
First, you cannot just let the patient suffer in profound hypogonadism. The severe depression and loss of libido will drive them right back to the black market steroids just to survive the day. An endocrinologist will often prescribe physiologic, normal medical doses of testosterone temporarily to ease the patient through the acute crash.
So a taper, essentially.
Then they deploy a specific pharmacological protocol to wake the body up. They frequently use a drug called clomiphene. Clomiphene acts directly on the hypothalamus and pituitary in the brain, essentially waking them up and stimulating them to resume producing LH and FSH.
If I can use another analogy, clomiphene is like attaching jumper cables to a dead car battery. It sends the electrical spark to the brain's control center to jumpstart the natural signaling process that was shut down by the steroid bonfire.
That is exactly what it does. And simultaneously, the endocrinologist might use HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, which acts directly on the testes further down the chain, waking them up to receive those new signals from the brain and start manufacturing testosterone naturally again.
And what about the sexual dysfunction?
They may also prescribe medications like sildenafil or Viagra to temporarily manage the severe erectile dysfunction during this lengthy recovery period. This is not just for physical function. It is absolutely crucial for preserving the patient's fragile psychological well-being and maintaining their relationship stability during a very dark time.
Okay, so the endocrinologist is using jumper cables to restart the hormonal hardware. While that is happening, how does the psychiatrist repair the software? How do you fix the dysmorphia?
Psychiatric repair focuses heavily on dismantling the entrenched cognitive distortions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is essential for treating the underlying muscle dysmorphia. The therapist works meticulously to help the patient identify and challenge their deeply false beliefs about their body size and worth.
And pharmacologically?
For the obsessive ruminative thoughts about body image, the constant mirror-checking serotonergic antidepressants, specifically SSRIs, have proven to be highly effective at reducing the obsessive-compulsive features. And finally, traditional addiction protocols such as contingency management and supportive expressive therapy are integrated to help the patient manage the intense cravings for the hedonic, dopamine-driven effects of the drugs.
It is a massive, highly coordinated undertaking, but it makes complete sense when you understand those three interlocking pathways of dependence we mapped out earlier. Okay, we have covered a monumental amount of ground today, from the lipid membranes of a cell to the forensic wards of Sweden. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure I have mentally mapped this perfectly. Let's play this out in a clinical scenario to test our reasoning for you listening at home.
Great idea. Let's run through some concepts.
Okay, let's say a 24-year-old male walks into my clinic. He's built like a tank, clearly carrying an unnatural amount of muscle mass, but his shoulders and back are covered in severe cystic acne. He sits down and tells me he is just taking corticosteroids to help with some joint pain from weightlifting. Based on everything we've discussed, my immediate red flag is that he's either profoundly confused or he is lying to my face because corticosteroids like cortisol or prednisone are anti-inflammatories. They have absolutely zero anabolic muscle-building properties. The massive muscle growth and the acne mean he is almost certainly injecting synthetic testosterone derivatives.
Your clinical reasoning is spot on. You have immediately identified the terminological confusion and used the physical hallmarks, the excessive lean mass, and the androgenic acne to deduce the true etiology of his presentation.
Excellent. And if I look at his demographic, a 24-year-old non-athlete seeking appearance enhancement, he perfectly fits the true epidemiological profile, completely bypassing the myth of the teenage Olympic hopeful. Now, let's say this same patient tells me he just finished a massive 30-week cycle and he feels like he is dying. He is severely depressed, can't get out of bed, and has zero libido. I know that biologically his brain sensed the massive external hormone flood and shut down his natural production. He is experiencing HPT axis suppression, leading to hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. His body is essentially running on empty.
Precisely. You have identified the neuroendocrine crash, which is pathway 2 of the dependence model.
Now, regarding his past behavior, if he admits he was taking over 1,500 milligrams of testosterone equivalent per week during that cycle, I know he was operating well inside the danger zone. I need to be actively screening him for a history of manic episodes, severe impulsivity, or psychotic symptoms, because the data shows those risks escalate dramatically once a user crosses that 1,000 milligram threshold.
Yes, and you would also be wise to gently probe for any history of idiosyncratic irritability or violent outbursts, keeping in mind the potential for anosognosia. He may not realize his behavior was abnormal.
And finally, when I collaborate with an endocrinologist to treat him, and I see they have prescribed clomiphene, I understand the exact mechanism. They aren't giving him more testosterone. They are using clomiphene to stimulate his pituitary gland, jump-starting the production of LH and FSH to wake his own tests back up.
Exactly. You have successfully integrated the molecular mechanism, the clinical presentation, and the pharmacological treatment into a cohesive mental model.
Brilliant. If you followed along with that clinical deduction, you have a highly robust grasp on the pathophysiology and clinical reality of these complex disorders. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to hand it over to our expert for a final, broader thought. We have spent an hour dissecting the profound pathology of the individual today. But zooming out, there is a much broader, almost philosophical context here, isn't there?
There is, and it raises a deeply provocative societal question that every clinician must grapple with. If the diagnostic criteria for AS dependence heavily feature muscle dysmorphia, this inescapable pathological terror of not being physically big enough, we have to take a hard look at the world these men actually live in.
It's the environment, right?
Exactly. Our cultural action figures, the superheroes in every summer blockbuster movie, the fitness influencers on their social media feeds, even the plastic toys that young boys play with, are currently displaying levels of vascularity and muscularity that are simply biologically impossible to achieve without massive, continuous chemical intervention.
It sets an impossible standard.
So the profound question we must ask ourselves as clinicians and as a society is this. Are we pathologizing the individual for simply adapting to a dysmorphic culture? How does a clinician successfully treat and heal the patient sitting in the consulting room when the society waiting for them just outside the door is itself fundamentally sick?
That is a phenomenal, unsettling question to sit with, and it changes exactly how you look at the colossus in the mirror. If you want to master this topic and truly solidify your clinical reasoning, I highly encourage you to read alongside Chapter 11.11 in Kaplan and Sedek's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry. Thank you for joining us in the deep dive. Here are the details of this episode.
Anabolic-Androgenic steroid-related disorders. Byline. Sometimes the strongest muscles conceal the most vulnerable mind. Episode description. A famous bodybuilder walks into Medlock Holmes' consulting room. He is physically magnificent, broad shoulders, sculpted chest, powerful arms. Yet Holmes notices something else. The man cannot stop looking at his reflection. Every polished surface becomes another mirror. Every missed gym session feels catastrophic. Every slight reduction in muscle size feels like losing part of himself. Holmes quickly realizes that this is not simply a story about muscles. It is a story about identity. Most people think anabolic-androgenic steroids, AAS, are drugs used by elite athletes chasing Olympic medals. Holmes discovers the opposite. Today, most users are ordinary men seeking a more muscular appearance rather than sporting success. The average age of first use is approximately 23 years, much later than most other illicit substances, and use is overwhelmingly confined to males. Holmes begins by separating two commonly confused substances. The drugs used by bodybuilders are anabolic-androgenic steroids, synthetic derivatives of testosterone designed to increase muscle growth while also producing masculinizing effects. These are entirely different from corticosteroids such as prednisolone, which reduce inflammation and have virtually no muscle-building properties. Confusing these two families of steroids remains remarkably common among both patients and clinicians. The detective then asks a more interesting question. If testosterone is a natural hormone, why does it become dangerous? The answer lies in dosage. Medical testosterone replacement simply restores normal physiological levels. Illicit users often consume 10 to 100 times therapeutic doses, frequently combining several different steroids simultaneously, stacking to achieve enormous supraphysiological androgen concentrations. The result is extraordinary muscle growth. But Holmes knows that biology never grants gifts without demanding payment. As the investigation progresses, Holmes uncovers a fascinating paradox. The body becomes stronger. The brain becomes less stable. Most users experience little psychiatric disturbance. However, a vulnerable minority develop profound psychological changes. Some become unusually energetic, need less sleep, feel invincible, become impulsive, spend recklessly, display intense irritability. Others develop frank mania or even psychosis with grandiose or paranoid delusions. The risk increases substantially with higher steroid doses, particularly above the equivalent of 1,000 milligrams of testosterone per week. Then comes the opposite problem. When the steroids stop, testosterone production collapses. The hypothalamic pituitary testicular (HPT) axis has been suppressed by months of external hormones. Instead of feeling like a titan, the user experiences profound depression, fatigue, and loss of libido. Many resume injecting steroids simply to escape this withdrawal state. Holmes uncovers three distinct traps that keep users locked in a cycle of dependence. 1. The psychological terror of losing muscle size, muscle dysmorphia. Holmes uncovers three distinct traps that keep users locked in a cycle of dependence. 2. The physical agony of the hormonal crash, hypogonadism. Holmes uncovers three distinct traps that keep users locked in a cycle of dependence. 3. The purely chemical addiction to the dopamine surges that drugs create in the brain's reward centers. Holmes uncovers three distinct traps that keep users locked in a cycle of dependence. To break this cycle, the detective concludes, requires both an endocrinologist to repair the body's hormonal engine and a psychiatrist to repair the mind's distorted mirror.